And today we have Elliott Parker, who's the CEO of High Alpha Innovation and the author of the new book, Illusion of Innovation, where he walks through just a lot of the different temperaments around why big corporations fail at innovation, why decentralized approach to innovation is the right way, and a host of other really great topics. Elliott, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Awesome. Well, hey, if we could just start off with, I always love to ask authors, my first question out of the gate is, obviously there was a problem that was rolling around in the back of your head, so much so that it was keeping you up at night and you decided to write a book about the topic. So I would love to just first start off, what was the inspiration? How long have you been thinking about writing this? And then, what was the main thing that you wanted to communicate to audiences when writing this book?
Yeah, good question, and you nailed it. I wrote the book as an exercise in getting rid of my frustration. So it's a mix of both love and frustration. Probably the way to describe it. If you think about, maybe in the minority, but I'm a huge fan of large corporations. Because they're kind of miraculous if you think about it. In the end, a corporation is at its root, it's a piece of paper where we all agree, we make some promises about the ways people are going to behave and what they're going to do, and that it holds together. And we turn these corporations into these things that are sometimes hundreds of thousands of employees all doing things and making things like the laptops we're talking on now. Mm-hmm. They're amazing. And the world didn't have to work out this way where we could collaborate at that level. At the same time, these large corporations are getting worse and worse at innovating. And it's not just true of corporations, it's true of all of our large institutions. We see it all the time. There's a great example recently, right? The Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, built a few years back in the 1930s. I think if I have it right, just recently they added a suicide net to the bridge. And that suicide net took longer to add than the bridge took to build originally, and cost more money in real dollars.
So that's crazy.
Something is different in the world today than it was 100 years ago, and I wanted to figure out what it was. And I had a sense of it, having worked with lots of really large corporations, trying to help them be more innovative. Had a sense of it, but I wanted to. Writing a book forced me to try and figure it out a little bit more and really put down on paper what I think.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I loved in the book, you mentioned that you're actually a fan of corporations, which I think that might fly contrarian to those who operate in the startup community and the VC and
well, that's the funny thing. I build startups for a living, right? That's what I do. That's what I love. But it's in part, it's in admiration of what these large corporations can do.
Yeah, well, corporations play their part, like you said, whether it's either innovating externally, innovating internally, or being the acquisition engine that gobbles up the companies that these founders dream of and are able to scale. And that's how they kind of maintain their position in the world, is via acquisition. I imagine that's becoming harder and harder when you have a company like Dollar Shave that scales up, and then what are you supposed to do? Just endlessly continue to buy these competitors that pop up. But, another thing that I've been witnessing, especially in this age of hyper accelerated social media, is that, you have this idea of what you're seeing emerging as the founder-led brand in the branded storytelling, where the CEO is essentially documenting their life as they stand up a startup. And what I think so interesting about I interviewed a gentleman who founded the company called Midday Squares, which is a really fast-growing chocolate brand up in Canada. And he kind of pioneered this term of build out loud. And the idea is, our culture is obsessed with Shark Tank. It's obsessed with the Kardashians. And by doing a reality TV show about him building the company, it created an unfair advantage for him to gain traction and share a voice on social and LinkedIn and places like that, a corporation just can't compete with that kind of authenticity from a leader perspective and a storytelling perspective when they're using old tropes like spokespersons and even
They're
more
too
modern
careful.
tactics.
Yeah, they're too careful. That's too risky.
Yeah. Well, hey, I'm probably getting off the rails too early in this interview. I think it's always important to dive a little bit into an author's background. So we have the source of your inspiration. Would you give us a little bit of your pedigree and kind of, your ascension up the corporate ladder as you had various professional experiences and eventually decided to start High Alpha? Could you give us some of the salient moments and maybe just a little bit of a backgrounder so we kind of understand the point of view in which you're writing this thesis?
Yep. Yeah. So I'm an entrepreneur by heart and by genetics. I come from a long line of entrepreneurs and grew up watching examples of that in my life. So I spent my life building companies. To date, I think have launched over 40 companies now, with a lot more on the way.
Wow.
I run a company called High Alpha Innovation that builds startups in collaboration with corporations and universities. And before that, worked in corporate venture capital. In addition to building startups along the way, worked in corporate venture capital. Spent many years working, living in Boston, working with at the consulting firm founded by a well-known guy in the world of innovation named Clayton Christensen, who was a Harvard Business School professor who came up with the idea of disruptive innovation, and saw firsthand there, working with a lot of large corporations around the world, trying to help them be more innovative. Saw that a lot of the things that they were doing just didn't work as well as they once did, and we needed different approaches.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I also love that early in the book, you gave us a David Ogilvy quote, which is from my neck of the woods, which is pertaining to the structure of decision-making. You quoted David Ogilvy in the idea that committees can criticize, but they cannot create. I think this goes as a through line to a lot of the different topics that you explore around the new makeup of teams. You give us an example of how startups have gone from, in the 90s, an average makeup of about 7 people down to somewhat like maybe 2 to 3 in the current iteration. Can you talk a little bit about the value of having agility inside of startups and small, unique teams that don't have to get buy-in by committee from external stakeholders?
Yeah, we've all felt and lived that, right? The David Ogilvy, he used to he liked to quote, I think it's G.K. Chesterton, who said, "Search the parks in all your cities, you'll find no statues of committees." Always a statue of like the one person who made a difference. And there's some truth in that. You think about let's compare and contrast corporations with their large teams, bureaucracies with small companies for a second. You think about these large corporations all began as startups. They were all super nimble. They came up with something new that got a foothold in the market, got traction, enabled them to scale over time. But as they scale, they get focused more and more on preserving what they've built. And rightfully so, actually. That's important. We want them to do that to a degree. And the way that we measure whether they're preserving what they've built and running their company well is we use metrics like return on invested capital and return on investment, IRR. I was a finance major in school, and I went to school and learned that these are the ways you tell if a company is being run successfully. It turns out when you focus your company on return on invested capital over quarterly and annual increments, what it does is it makes your company really careful. Careful in the short term, not in the long term. And so the way that works out is companies are hyper efficient from a capital standpoint. Think about I have this example in the book, supply chains during COVID. Companies built these amazing supply chains, hundreds of factories around the world, millions of parts being made each day, super efficient, stuff showing up just at the right time in the right places in Shanghai or wherever. And then one part of that system breaks during COVID and the whole thing comes crashing down. So it was super efficient until all of a sudden it wasn't, not resilient.
Yeah, interwoven systems kind of in a fatal flaw, right?
Totally. And so that appearance of being careful and making things predictable and safe is actually super risky. Now you see the opposite in startups. Startups don't have anything to preserve. In fact, they're trying to take down what exists and build their new thing. And so they're willing to take a lot of chances and try new things. Their teams are small. They're not that careful in the near term, meaning decisions are made by a couple of people, right? That you might build statues for one day. They're not optimized for preservation. They're not optimized for near-term capital efficiency. They're optimized for rapid growth, learning, and scaling. And so there's merit in both of these approaches. And that's the important thing. Both of these approaches are right in the right circumstances, but they're designed to do very different things. And there's a great example, Ford versus Ferrari, one of my favorite movies.
Yeah, it's a good one.
There's a great scene in that movie where Carroll Shelby, who's the super entrepreneur, shows up at the Ford offices in Dearborn, Michigan, and Henry Ford III points to the factories out the window and says, "Hey, during World War II, these factories were converted to make a good chunk of the airplanes that won the war." It's very obvious in that moment. Ford Motor Company could do something like that in World War II. Carroll Shelby in his little factory in Santa Monica, wherever he was, could not pull that off. So there's merit in both of these. We need all of these things, but the mistake people make is thinking that these corporations can innovate like a startup. They can't. They're not designed to do it. They're not optimized for that quick learning and the mistake making. They're optimized for avoiding mistakes. And so if you were inside a big company and you want to try new things, do things differently, and you're going to have to make some mistakes, and all the incentives are pushing against you. Once you recognize that, you realize there's some merit in maybe pushing some of this innovation outside the organization altogether and relying more on small teams in the form of startups. But the same thing's true in startups, right? It's important for people in small teams. Think about people in small agencies, for example, to recognize that their superpower is actually in experimentation. Because when you're right, you can be really, really right. And when you're wrong, it doesn't matter that much.
Yeah, I think you mentioned comparing it to biology, and the evolution of the species is done at the fringes, where over large periods of time, biology can test different small innovations, and it's not going to collapse the species if they make a small mutation goes in one direction or the other. I think you illustrated a really interesting example of moths in Great Britain during the Industrial Revolution, and just the idea that originally these moths 100 years prior to the Industrial Revolution were gray because they sat on the bark of trees. And then as soot and pollution started coating the sides of buildings and trees, they evolved to become darker in complexion in a very rapid succession, much to their preservation, but it wasn't a rapid adaptation. I think that was kind of the point.
Yeah. If you think about if you don't know what the future is going to be like, and none of us do, none of us can predict the future. The best way to prepare for an uncertain or unknown future the best way to maximize returns and minimize risk in the face of an unknown future is to run as many experiments as you can at the lowest possible cost per experiment. The problem inside our organizations, or think about what we do at a government level or these big universities, we don't run very many experiments, really. And the ones we do end up being centralized and really expensive, whether they fail or succeed. Nature does it very differently, right? That one moth that has the first mutation and then survives and then continues to propagate, the system is poised to adopt that when it works and to make sure it gets spread. But there's no central communication about it. There's no plan. It's a little bit random. It's kind of a march from what currently exists to see what's possible. And somehow we need to make our organizations work more like that if we want them to be resilient.
Yeah, that's interesting. You mentioned something that I had never really considered, and is the idea of big organizations can pivot. You think of the example that you gave, which Ford, for a period of time, because of an existential crisis like a world war, was able to completely pivot out from the automobile industry into the manufacturing of military hardware. But I guess to some degree it was making, similar products for a different use case and a different end consumer, going from distributing to customers to one centralized entity, which is the US government. But it does seem to dawn on me that under the right circumstances, large organizations can pivot if they're forced by external circumstances. Have you ever given much research into that idea?
Yeah, if you look at the examples of large organizations that have transformed, meaning they've gone from one primary business model, operating model, to another one, there are some great examples of it. And what I find, this is anecdotal. Like, somebody needs to do the deep research on this, but anecdotally, you see a few things that are true in the circumstances where they are able to pivot and transform. On the one hand, often you have a founder who's still running the business.
Okay.
Right. So they've got that entrepreneurial spirit and the ability to kind of look, I built this, and so I can take it down. Right? The board's like, okay, yeah, you've proven yourself before, go for it. Think about like Amazon developing AWS, transformation in the underlying engine of the business model. But you had a founder in place who was able to pull that off. And in other circumstances, they were generating a lot of cash that enabled them to run experiments. Think about Meta right now is doing this. They let go like a third of their staff a few years ago, increased the capital efficiency of the business dramatically, which is useful if you're then going to invest that new capital in something. They're putting $40 billion a year into AI right now.
Crazy.
You imagine half of that's a total waste. Okay, so they're putting $20 billion. Like, that is really hard to compete with, and they're positioned to succeed for a long time because of it. That's pretty amazing. So when you have a founder in place and lots of capital, now that's not true of most companies. So are there other examples of companies that transformed? IBM's gone through like 5 transformations.
Yeah, great example.
And when they did it, it was one of these it's always an existential crisis. If we don't pivot and change, we're not going to have a business in a couple of years. And so that's the other circumstance where you do see these transformations where, like, you're forced to, you're going to go out of business if you don't. The problem is for all those organizations in the middle where they're doing okay, they're making decent profit year by year, the founder's long gone, there's no existential threat. How do you innovate? And you see them all setting up these innovation teams, giving their innovation huge budgets, and like, okay, go transform our company. It's never worked. Every company's been doing it for decades. It's never once worked to drive transformation, and everybody continues to do it. Like, it helps us all feel good, like we're busy. But in many cases, it's a waste of time and resources. It's the wrong approach. You need to do just something else.
I think you liken to it as the zoo or something like that. Like, it's a useful exercise in getting on a corporate stockholder call and talking about the things that you're doing. It's a good PR experiment. Maybe, it's good for your social justice cause marketing department.
Oh, I see that all the time.
But it's rarely transforms business models.
Yeah.
Very interesting. There was another quote that stood out to me. Why is the worst place to launch a new business model inside of your existing business model?
Yeah, good old Clay Christensen quote. We tweeted that out one day, and I love it. The worst place to start a new business is within your existing business model, because that existing business model is optimized for something else. So the way we sometimes explain this to companies or executives is there's a difference between the magnitude of correctness and the frequency of correctness. What I mean by that is oftentimes you're in a situation where you can be wrong a lot, because when you're right, you really, it works out well. Think about venture capital. So in my world, venture capital, make a lot of investments, start a lot of companies, knowing that many of them may not play out. And the downside risk in the grand scheme of things is not that big. It's worth an experiment to see what happens, because if it works out, it can change the world and create amazing results for everybody involved. So the frequency of correctness doesn't matter. The magnitude of correctness is what we're after. Think about what happens in a large company. It's the exact opposite. the magnitude of correctness doesn't matter. We don't care how right you are because you don't really benefit from it personally. Just don't be wrong. Don't make mistakes. And so it's the frequency of correctness. You just need to be right 100% of the time. Don't take chances. Don't take chances. And that's the problem. You think about large organizations contrasting with small organizations, or large teams and small teams. Large teams are really good at execution. We know what the problem is. We spot a problem. We know what we need to do. We just have to go do it. So think about like a large company that comes up with a new product idea to fill a gap in the market. It's a form of innovation that's really important, but it's an execution challenge. Contrast that with what small teams are good at, which are learning challenges, where we know what the problem is. We're not sure how to solve it. It's really ambiguous, actually. We have to go figure it out. Large companies are really good at execution problems. Startups are awful at it. They don't know how to execute. Learning challenges, where there's ambiguity about how to proceed, large companies will always lose to small companies in learning challenges, almost always, because those small teams are optimized for making the mistakes to learn really quickly, to figure out what needs to happen. No preconceived notions, very few assumptions about how things worked before. It needs to be how things work in the future. So learning challenges and execution challenges. It's really important if you're working in an organization, whether it's small or large, to consider we have a problem in front of us. Is this an execution problem or a learning problem? Do we need a small team or a big team? Is our company, because of its size, poised to succeed or not? If you're in a small team and it's an execution challenge, big companies are going to beat you. Maybe you want to partner with them instead. And the opposite is true. It's a learning challenge in a big company. Maybe you want to partner with a startup on this. They're going to be able to move faster.
Yeah, that's interesting. And you also talked about the idea in the example of Jeff Bezos and Amazon about how they have a low amount of communication with their innovation groups from the perspective of silos. Like they're not reporting into some central management group on a frequent basis. They actually want to have a low degree of communication with other departments because it allows them to go out and innovate and then bring finished breakthroughs back to the company. And you mentioned AWS was actually one such experiment that really wasn't designed to be its own successful, massive profit center within the org. It was an experiment to bolster up their own capacity internally for some separate projects. So would you talk a little bit about that idea of how do you create those lower communication silos in which departments aren't, I guess, spoiling these experiments, or outside stakeholders aren't spoiling these experiments?
It's super counterintuitive, isn't it? It's funny. I work with these teams all the time. They're like, well, okay, we're going to go meet with all the stakeholders across the organization. We're going to tell them what we're doing. And I'm like, no, don't do that. Stop it. That's a really bad idea. If you're working on something that really is transformative and different, that's the key difference. If you're working on something that's incrementally different, that looks a lot like what we already do, yes, you've got to get all the stakeholders involved. You need them all the way in. There's a political scientist, a really wise man named Francis Fukuyama, who coined the term vetocracy. And what he meant by that was a situation, an organization in which one person's veto ends up making the decision. Inside a large organization, that's how, because these organizations are primed and optimized for safety, one person saying no, it requires almost unanimous consent a lot of the time. One person saying no can bring down a new idea. That's a vetocracy. And so the last thing you want to do actually in that circumstance is communicate broadly, because you're opening up the door for somebody to say no. You're constraining the bounds in which you're able to run experiments. All the experiments end up looking like what we already do. So when you're trying to do something transformative and new and different in an organization, it's counterintuitive, but you don't actually want to communicate that broadly. And that's the same thing we see in nature, as we were talking about, right? Think about evolution in an ecosystem like the Amazon jungle. It happens at the fringes. Individual cells and organisms, if it works, it takes off and can get adopted. There's no central committee approving the changes or mutations, or deciding like, okay, next year we're going to increase the number of black moss by X%. And we're like, no. It's not centrally communicated or organized. People don't thrive in that type of environment, by the way. That kills creativity. There's one more diversion. There's a great example of this to bring this to life. Jack Welch was the CEO of General Electric. Very great leader, like convinced people to do amazing things. That company performed amazingly for a long time in terms of capital efficiency because of what he did. But ultimately, I think he killed the company's ability to innovate. And my thesis is that he came out back in the 80s, 90s and said variance is evil inside of companies. What he meant by that was, let's make everything predictable. No more error. Implement Six Sigma, all these things. We're going to make everything as predictable as we can and be able to know what's going to happen 3 years from now. And people don't thrive. It's very hard to be creative in that type of circumstance. You contrast that with somebody like Reed Hastings, the founder and CEO of Netflix. Netflix is a company that transformed multiple times, right? DVD in the mail to digital delivery to production of their own content. Those are big transformations in the business model. And whether it'll get to the next one now that Reed Hastings isn't there anymore, we'll see, right? But anyway, went through transformations. What Reed Hastings said was the messiness is good to a degree. He said chaos, if it's fertile, will always beat sterility. And so that's the thing. Companies, organizations, teams need to adopt a certain amount of deliberate capital inefficiency, some mistake making on purpose to be able to make the discoveries that you're going to need that drive resilience. If you get rid of all those mistakes, you don't learn anymore. You don't progress. You're static. You stay put while everybody else marches on and continues to change. It's true in our personal lives too, by the way, not just in companies.
Yeah. Well, also, Netflix is known for having that very flat management organization as well, right? Where it's decentralized management and their culture book that's gone viral. And, it's not, I guess, a surprise that they've been better than, Blockbuster to name, they're oftentimes looked at as, one of those companies that was a disruptor, but also, completely destroy or completely absorbed an old category because of their ability to innovate and pivot and change.
Yeah. And not for everyone, right? I've read a lot about it. Seems like a hard place to work.
Yeah.
Not for everybody. Find what makes sense for you personally, what your objectives are, what you're trying to do. But different organizations are optimized for different things. But in every case, a certain degree of messiness is required. You can't get rid of it.
Yeah, I wanted to bring an example from the advertising world to that smaller group of stakeholders and lower barriers of communication idea that you mentioned. I once interviewed the chief marketing officer of State Farm, or Farmers Insurance rather, at the time. And he talked about the idea of like creative by committee, the same thing. And then the other component of that is that, advertising especially but in other disciplines, this is true. It's because we're all consumers of it. We all have opinions, even though we know you maybe shouldn't be the person to, to weigh in. Like I would probably never walk into the chief information officer's, office and say, hey, I really think we should migrate our service from, Microsoft to Google because I don't have an experience with that, but there's this idea that the bigger the group of people in communication around a creative idea for something as important as a Super Bowl ad, the worse and more dumbed down the creative gets. So it's very important to have small groups of approvers on your most important campaigns and your most creative ideas. So holds true in advertising as well. So.
No better example of that than pharmaceutical advertising.
Oh,
right? So I think it's like 60% of TV advertising now, or at least the dollars pharma ads.
Yep. Yeah.
And we've done some work with pharmaceutical companies. In fact, we just launched a startup in this space to make pharmaceutical ads maybe a little bit more interesting.
That would be amazing.
The problem is you have these ads, everything's so regulated. So you have down to the fonts that get used, even the images, the words, size of the words. By the time an ad for a pharmaceutical company shows up on TV, it's gone through 30, sometimes 30 rounds of legal and regulatory review. So not only is it committee, it's a whole bunch of lawyers leaning and saying, no, you need to change that word or add a comma here or whatever. And of course it's ineffective in the end. It's like the perfect, most extreme example of what you're saying.
Yeah, totally. It's and basically when you're stuck with one medium and that's the only place you can do things, and you're in that tightly regulated environment, it just creates, ads that are damn near unwatchable, in my opinion. But what are you going to do? An interesting insight that I never thought about was this idea that if you see a company is buying back its stock, it's basically telling you that they are having problems with innovation and they no longer believe in the future. Pretty telling. Great tip for those, Robinhood traders out there. But this is not a financial show, nor am I
investment advice.
I would just I thought that was really insightful. Would you mind giving a little bit more insight into that?
Now, to be clear, there are legitimate reasons for doing share buybacks. But when you look at the pace of share buybacks in public markets over time, we're seeing it happen more often than ever. And one very valid interpretation of that is that companies are less capable of using those dollars to produce a return better than they believe the individual investors can get on their own. Meaning they're effectively admitting we can't innovate faster than the market. You're going to get a better return taking this money back from us and investing it somewhere else. That is what they are saying. And so yes, they're admitting that somebody else is going to be able to innovate and earn a better return than we can.
Wow.
That's a problem. And so evidence that one sign that corporations are worse at innovation is that you see the dramatic increase in the amount of share buybacks over the years. Even though we have fewer public companies, it's an issue. Now, like I said, with the caveat, there are sometimes legitimate reasons for doing share buybacks. I can hear my finance professor's voices in my head, but not the extent to which we see it. It's a sign that there's something going on.
Yeah. Another thing that I thought was interesting is you talked about the idea that trend analysis to some degree is a futile exercise, and that by the time something is a trend, there's no longer an opportunity to innovate. I was wondering if you could touch a little bit on that, because that's so much of the approach, at least as marketers, that we're often trying to deploy is, what's the trend today on TikTok and how do we copy it? Or what's the trend in, consumer packaging or fonts or storytelling? What influencers are people using? Trends almost drives our industry to a degree of madness to some degree, I would say. But why is that true within innovation, that once you spot a trend, it's probably too late?
Yeah, because it's already being exploited by others. Yeah, and so the trick is to be the person who invents the next trend, I suppose. And that's a lot. That's hard to do, admittedly. But so many companies come to me and say, okay, well, our innovation efforts, we've got a team that's doing a 6-month study of what are the big trends in our industry. It's like I can spend the next hour. We could probably outline 90% of the trends you're identifying in your expensive study with the consultants you're paying. It's not, these things are obvious, right? And the end result comes back like, okay, well, the demographic changes look like this, and all sorts of crazy things. It's just like, it's too late. Everybody already knows this, or you missed it. So how do you get ahead and get to the next one? And the way you do it, and again, this is harder said than done, but what you've got to do, if I'm an advertiser trying to figure out what's the next TikTok trend going to be that I want to get ahead and define before somebody else does, you have to be listening for weak signals in the market, meaning being open to these things that seem heretical and crazy and contrary to the way we do things now. You're looking for Clay Christensen, we mentioned that I worked with. He had a sign outside his door at his office at Harvard Business School that said "Anomalies Wanted." He was always looking for someone to come in and challenge his theories because it made them better. And so you're looking for weak signals, things that challenge the way we think the world works. Those things, our nature is to push those out. Certainly organizational nature is to push those things out and ignore them and say that can't be true because in our organization we believe X. Those are the things you need to find ways to amplify. And the way that you can lean into those and understand them better is by running experiments. Very cheap, inexpensive, fast experiments at the margins can help you determine whether those weak signals are worth caring about. But that's how you identify those trends. If you think about the trends on TikTok that people are using, those are the results of somebody that did something that seemed a little bit crazy at first. In some ways, it was a form of an experiment. The problem is you don't know ahead of time which experiments are going to catch on and work. And so you have to take a portfolio approach to these things if you do it systematically. You can get lucky, or you can take a portfolio approach and do it systematically and say, we're just going to run a bunch of these experiments and see which get traction.
Yeah, I love that. Another quote that I loved in the book is that the best experiments actually lead to more experiments. Can you talk about that idea of why is that the best outcome is, to come to not a black and white conclusion, but more questions than maybe you started with that then leads you down more paths?
Yeah, because they uncover anomalies. You think about most experiments that organizations run, whether they may not explain it this way, but you look at what you might define as experiment. Experiment is something you do where you don't know what the result's going to be ahead of time. Most of the experiments run inside of our organizations are actually, when you dig into it, they're designed to reinforce what we already know. They're designed to validate the way we think the world works, because that helps us feel good. Like, oh, we're right. We're really smart. Look, we ran an experiment and it proved that we were right. And we still are. That doesn't lead to more experimentation or discovery, though. It leads you to go further and further down the path of what you're already doing. And so you need to run experiments that lead you to uncover new ways, that uncover those anomalies, that tell you, actually, this thing that I thought was true, it turns out isn't. And this is a whole new way of looking at the world. I think about the way I try to run my own personal life, have interactions with people all the time, try and stretch. You mentioned this before we started recording the podcast. Having a podcast is a great way to meet lots of people with other points of view that helps you uncover those anomalies and those contradictions and those things that say, oh, that's not how I thought the world worked. And then you dig into it and say, okay. So that's a form of running an experiment that leads you to then go run more experiments. You want to run those things that are actually designed to challenge the status quo, challenge what we think is true, so that you can go do more testing and uncover those things that you can find out before the rest of the world does. That's how you win in business. You're non-consensus and you turn out to be right.
I like that. And how do you set good constraints and guide rails for those experiments? I think you gave a really great example in the book where you were working in the innovation group at a medical device firm, and you outlined the preposterous idea that even though the money or the financial markers were telling you that the best thing you could possibly do is open up ice cream parlors, that probably wouldn't be very core to the mission or the DNA or the ultimate goals or the strategic advantage that you had as a company, the type of intellectual capital that you have. Even if that was the best use of funds, so to speak, it wouldn't be the best experiment for your group and your company to run. So how do you set up good guardrails in which you're testing theories that might have the most amount of impact, so you're not going too far off the rails in your experimentation?
Yeah. It's not just the quantity of experiments that you run, right? You could say, well, great. Elliott said, we got to go run up a whole bunch of experiments, try to go do things. Well, chaos is not a proper response to, right? You have sterility on one end of the extreme. That's not good. Well, the other extreme isn't good either. You need to find the balance in the middle where, as Reed Hastings said, the fertile chaos exists, right? So I think in the book I write about this. I think you can actually learn a lot from the 3-point rule in the MBA about this. What we learn from the 3-point rule, I'll cut to the summary and then explain it. What we learn from the 3-point rule is that it is the quantity and quality of shots taken that matters. So in 1978, 1979, the NBA implemented the 3-point rule and said, if you make a basket from beyond this point, this line, you'll get 3 points instead of 2, which is everywhere else on the court. And so at the beginning, when this rule was implemented, people thought it was maybe a passing fad. It's not going to change the game. It totally changed the game. Mm-hmm. And actually, as someone who watches basketball games from time to time, it made the game a lot more fun to watch. Now what happens in before this rule, most of the shots were taken from pretty close to the net because that's where you were guaranteed to get to score. Now all the shots are taken right by the net and just beyond the 3-point line. Hardly in the middle, because that's where you're optimizing for scoring. And so the teams that score the most points are the teams that also take the most shots, but they do it very strategically from right by the net and right beyond the 3-point line. I think there's a lesson in that for our organizations. Yes, you need to take a lot of shots close to the net, what you know how to do well. But there's merit in taking some of those shots that may pay off more. Might be harder to execute. Your percentage chance of making them is going to be lower, but when they pay off to a greater extent. And so you want to be taking those too. So the trick is to be running those experiments that reinforce, challenge, help you identify things that are new and different ways of doing things, but that reinforce your strategic assets, the things you do well as an organization. I wish ice cream parlors were profitable. I'd go open one. We're not. I'm not good at it, so I'm not going to do it. Right? No. There are certain things I'm good at as a person. There are certain things my team is good at that define the bounds in which we're willing to run experiments and try new things. Once you are clear about that, you've got a lot of freedom. In most cases, more freedom to operate than you think as an organization.
Yeah, that's cool. So one of my favorite parts of the books was the story of Walt Disney, and you illustrate an interesting time in his life that I wasn't aware of, having gone to film school and studied at least a decent amount of the history of the cinema industry. But this idea that he had become a bit disenfranchised with the business, post World War II, when they went from manufacturing, propaganda films or government films, and then coming back home, and the cost of the technology had come down. There were more competitors, and he was fairly disassociated with the business. He had hired a management team around him to kind of take care of a lot of the day-to-day. And suddenly he became enamored with electric trains as a hobby. And that pursuit, almost some would say, addictive pursuit or obsession to some degree of this idea of electric trains and miniatures and building diorama and things of that nature, really was the breakthrough that he needed to come up with the concept of Disneyland, in which your childhood home stood in front of the fireworks. I thought that was a really great way to kind of bring back your personal connection to California and Orange County. But I just love this concept of the idea that novelty and things you find interesting sometimes will lead to the biggest breakthrough. I find, for me personally, I need to spend time in different modalities of exercise. We both talked about connecting over surfing. Surfing is one of my favorites, but I actually don't get much work done when I'm surfing because I'm so in the moment and so enthralled with where's the wave going to break. It's it actually is very zen and very, you have to be very conscious of what's happening in surfing in order to get the best waves, as you know. But the place that I find where I do the most amount of breakthrough is actually when I run outdoors. Can't run on a treadmill, but if I run outdoors, I get tons of ideas, and I, very frequently will jot open an app and take those ideas down, and that's what leads to blogs and social media posts and ideas for podcasts, etc. I don't know if that's exactly the same comparison, but I would love to learn more about this idea of novelty and exploration and that leading to innovative breakthrough.
Yeah, I think that's well said. And for me, it's funny, surfing in particular. I remember seeing there was a surf movie that came out when I was growing up, and one of the surfers they interviewed was going on about how surfing is a totally selfish pursuit. there's like no redeeming quality to society. And I thought, yeah, that's kind of right. Maybe I should feel bad about it. I don't think that's true. Actually, I think that we all need those moments where you need to unstring your bow, right? And that's when the ideas start to flow. The Walt Disney example is a really good one because the people around him thought he had lost his mind. He was, man, he was pretty, we say now he was depressed. At the time, we maybe didn't have quite the language around it. But he was depressed. He was having a hard time figuring out his passion. It just wasn't exciting to him anymore, making these movies. There's too much competition. It cost too much. He couldn't get the best animators to work for him anymore. And he went to this train show in Chicago with his friend and came back just absolutely obsessed with model trains, to the point where he moved his family. This is the obsession. Moved his family to a new house with a backyard that was big enough to put a ride-on train in the backyard. Wow. So people legitimately thought he had lost his mind. He'd gone crazy, and it was so sad. This entertainment genius was gone, a storytelling genius. I guess that's done. He's not going to do this anymore. And what he figured out was how to piece together that storytelling ability with rides, and then making the cities and the scenes around the trains experiences. When he started touring those little dioramas around the country, he called it Disneylandia. And that combination of those different things, those building blocks, that led to him to come up with the idea of Disneyland. The same thing is true of any innovation you look at. If you think about, I think the best car ever designed is the Porsche. The Porsche, like the elements of that, the engine and everything that goes in that car, all these little inventions along the way over the last thousands of years, those are all building blocks that came together. If you had gone back in time to the 1500s and said, okay, in the year 2024, there'd be these things called Porsche 911s. This is going to, like, here's how it's going to work. You can go really fast. It's really fun. And if you'd said, it's like, okay, I'm going to build one now, that sounds amazing. You wouldn't have had the building blocks, and you actually would have missed it. You never would have invented a Porsche 911. That it took that random walk of the discovery of the building blocks along the way to build on. So you think about, in our own lives, we have those building blocks, and we might think about running experiments and what we do, that search for novelty, in a way is just it's the discovery of new building blocks, or making ourselves, it's expanding the surface area of luck. This is true also of our organizations. You can expand the surface area of luck by collecting more insights, collecting more building blocks that lead to the combinations that help you uncover new ways of doing things. So you've got to run a lot of experiments to gather those insights. You don't know ahead of time which ones are going to prove to be most useful. Who knew? Disney wouldn't have known before hopping on the train to Chicago that electric trains were going to play such an important part in his life, and in the lives of all of us as a result, actually. What an impact that had. Who knew?
Yeah, so, totally. And I
right?
Yeah, and I think you illustrated that it had some connection to his childhood, where someone in his family allowed him to ride the train and sell candy and soda to people who were working on the railroad. So there was this real visceral personal attachment and association with it. I get a lot of my entrepreneurial bent because my grandfather, took me along to his window manufacturing plant in Washington. And though that the business model was not sexy, he definitely made being an entrepreneur look cool. Being a business owner, being someone who is in charge of their own destiny, had the things like a Cadillac, in his life that made him happy and was signs of independence. So I think a lot of our entrepreneurial expressions, can harken back to those childhood memories or those formative years, which I thought was pretty interesting as well. So great story, great anecdote. Like I told you at the beginning of before we switched the cameras on, there are a lot of innovation books out there that are not easy reads. They're dense, they're heavy. They don't have great storytelling anecdotes that kind of illustrate some of these points. So I would definitely encourage the audience to check it out. Elliott, we are rounding the corner, getting close to the end of the hour. So a question that I always love to ask guests is around this topic of innovation and the work that you're doing at a high alpha. What are you most excited about the future? What's the next year look like for you?
Oh, I'm excited about the startups we're building. We've got 9 right now coming off the assembly line, where we've got it all approved. We're just putting the teams together and cap tables and launching them, and it's so much fun. There's just an endless amount of opportunity out in the world, and that gets me excited every day. So much to do.
I love it. Well, Elliott, anywhere you want to point our guests, I'd love, of course, if you could plug where they could find the book, but also if folks want to reach out and get in touch with you, would you like to point them somewhere and how they can connect?
Sure. Yeah, The Illusion of Innovation, available wherever books are sold.
Nice.
Amazon, also Audible version coming out here soon.
Oh, perfect. Yep. I was kind of glad there wasn't an audiobook yet. I prefer, I didn't get the paperback, but I got the Apple version, and definitely from a research perspective, I pay more attention when I read.
Right on.
Awesome.
Yeah, my Twitter, ER Parker. You find me on Twitter too, ER Parker as well.
Very cool. Well, Elliott, thanks so much for coming on the show. It was an absolute pleasure to dive into your insights through reading the book and also through this interview. So for those of you who are watching and listening at home, if you subscribe, we'll have more killer episodes coming out later in the months and weeks ahead. And if you would be so kind as to give us a review, that's how the show finds a wider audience in an organic way. So don't forget to review the show if you enjoyed it. And most importantly, if there was an entrepreneur out there in your life, or perhaps that corporate innovations officer within your network, or an operator inside of the marketing world, anybody who you think would enjoy the topics that Elliott and I discussed today, don't forget to share the show with a colleague. So until next time, Elliott, thanks so much for coming on. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Dylan.